Good evening. Good evening. If you could just take your seats, and there's plenty of space. And hopefully you all have a card and a pen so you can ask questions at the end. I am Lucinda White. I'm the board president of the Maine Chapter of the United Nations Association USA. And our chapter is very thankful to Bowdoin College and the Bowdoin Model UN Club for co-sponsoring this evening's program. On behalf of the board and our chapter members, I am delighted to welcome our distinguished keynote speaker, United States Senator Angus King, and to welcome Peter Yeo, president of the Better World campaign and a vice president at the United Nations Foundation, who will lead off our program with some positive remarks on the UN. I also welcome all of you as we gather to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. I am happy to share the honor of introducing our speakers with Bowdoin's President Clayton Rose. President Rose was officially inaugurated just last week, and as many of you already know, is an eminent teacher and author on leadership, managerial values and ethics, and the role of business in society. I will be introducing Peter Yeo. If any of you went to college in my era, you might know Peter Rose, the sociologist. That's why I've had trouble with this, but Peter Yeo and President Rose will be introducing Senator King. After Senator King has finished his presentation, we will have a question and answer session. To streamline the questions and answers, we are asking you to submit your questions in writing. During Senator King's presentation, please make note of your question or questions, and you may submit it then either by index card, or if you have a cell phone and wish, you may do it by Twitter feed. The index card system is easy. Use the card and pen or pencil you received when you entered the auditorium. And there will be people in the aisles at the end, volunteers, who will collect the cards and bring them to the front of the room. And if you're Twitter savvy, you can submit your questions via Twitter to #UNBowdoin. And Professor Barbara Elias of the Bowdoin Government Department and her team will be collating and presenting your questions one by one to Senator King immediately following the presentation, allowing us to cover as many questions as possible. Moving now to the introductions. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Yeo, President of the Better World Campaign and Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at the United Nations Foundation. Peter leads the Foundation's engagement with the U.S. Congress and the administration to advance policy changes that support the UN's work for global progress. Peter's work with the Foundation helps ensure that the U.S. remains a strong leader at the UN. Notably, Peter also spearheaded a strategic alliance between the Foundation and UNA USA, resulting in the largest network ever of UN supporters across the United States. Prior to joining the UN Foundation, Peter worked in senior roles on a broad range of foreign policy and foreign aid issues for over 20 years in Washington, first at the US State Department and then at the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Capitol Hill. We are very glad that Peter was able to join us this evening to kick off our UN Day program. Please welcome Peter Yeo.
Well, thank you very much to Bowdoin. Thank you to Model UN. Evan, thank you for the tour of Bowdoin today. Greatly appreciated. And thank you to UNA Maine, in particular, for its dynamic leadership under Lucinda White, for hosting today's very important celebration of the 70th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. Happy UN Day to everybody. The UN had its opening ceremony 70 years ago today, and strong American leadership by President Roosevelt and by President Truman, and by an overwhelming 89-2 vote by the U.S. Senate ratifying the UN Charter was essential to the creation of the UN. In fact, 3 of the aye votes on that momentous day in 1945, when senators reached across the aisle to work with each other, came from Bowdoin alums. So Senator King, given the occasional gridlock we have in Washington, I hope that we can send a few more Bowdoin alums your way. Bowdoin's polar bear connection to the UN, however, did not end there. Tom Pickering, featured actually extensively this week during the Benghazi hearing in Washington, became one of America's greatest diplomats, as well as America's ambassador to the UN. And San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee just presided over the 70th anniversary celebration of the UN in its birthplace, San Francisco, with the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. So on these special anniversaries, we tend to look back with a rosy glow. But here's what the UN did instead. The 193 UN countries got together to write a new set of global goals to replace the Millennium Goals that had governed the world since from 2000 to 2015. The Millennium Goals measurably moved the needle. They lifted 600 million people out of extreme poverty. They boosted primary education enrollment to 90% in the global south. And they made sure that 2.6 billion people actually have safe water to drink. But we can't stop halfway. And the UN member states knew we needed a new plan. So as part of the My World initiative, 8 million people around the world were given the opportunity to vote on what the new goals should look like. And here at home, UNA USA held 50 consultations around this country, including one right here in Maine, with the results being handed over to American negotiators. With this global input and strong American leadership, the UN last month agreed upon 17 global goals focused on achieving 3 extraordinary things: ending extreme poverty, fighting inequality and injustice, and fixing climate change. And unlike the past Millennium Goals, these goals are a to-do list for all countries, not just for the developing world. Countries will measure whether they're actually meeting the goals using the latest techniques in gathering data. And the new goals don't just rely upon foreign assistance to work with other countries. Instead, they call on countries to better use their own domestic resources, to end corruption and fraud, and harness the power and resources of the private sector. So at a time when you see the world torn apart by so many conflicts, we see it in the millions of people forced from their homes in Syria, there is something powerful in the fact that 193 countries of the UN were able to come together and agree on a to-do list for the planet. Now, I know what many of you are thinking, which is 17 goals is too many, and I hear that. But here's the upside. Unlike the goals they replace, the new global goals are comprehensive and actually reflect the input of millions of people around the world, as well as their governments. And this input will greatly enhance our collective ability to get the job done. So within these 17 goals, there's something that speaks to all of us. I welcome the fact that the new goals call for combating climate change and mitigating the worst aspects of our rapidly warming planet. And I'm happy that the goals call for sustainable use of our oceans, seas, and marine resources. Neither one of these two issues were tackled in the Millennium Goals. And as Mainers, you should be grateful that you have a Senator, Angus King, who is a leading force in the US Senate for meaningful action to fight climate change and to protect our oceans. Whether co-founding the Senate Arctic Caucus or standing with the many Mainers who marched at the UN in support of climate action, Senator King is an anchor on the issues that are about not only protecting the planet and its people, but are at the heart of the new global goals. And as active citizens, wherever we live, we need to help policymakers like Senator King support the UN, support the global goals, and other UN causes. Simple steps matter. from tweeting thanks to @SendAngusKing, and posting a photo from tonight on Instagram to help spread the word, to writing an email to your elected officials about what about the global goal resonates with you, or meeting with your elected officials on a regular basis to go into greater depths on these issues, and most importantly, to join UNA Maine, as I am a member of UNA Maryland. And that's what's so exciting about, from my perspective, the new global goals. It's about all of us. It's not just the wealthy nations telling the developing world what to do. It's about shared commitment and global involvement. And know that when you advocate, the American people are with you. We just released polling 2 days ago showing that 62% of Americans, 62%, have a favorable impression of the United Nations. It's hard to find any institution in the US that anybody thinks positively of, but I have to say the UN beat out President Obama, NATO, UNICEF, and Congress. Sorry, Senator King. Nothing personal, if it was just you. And 90% of Americans want the US to remain actively engaged in the UN. So thank you for letting me come this evening to share a few thoughts about the UN's 70th anniversary and the new global goals. It's also my privilege to share the stage tonight with the president of Bowdoin College, Clayton Rose. In his inaugural address to Bowdoin, was it really just a week ago? It's hard to believe. President Rose said that a Bowdoin liberal arts education represents, quote, the promise of courageous engagement in civic life and with our toughest problems. So for me, as a graduate of a liberal arts college myself and the father of a young man over there, hopefully headed in the liberal arts direction in the near future, I couldn't agree more. The United Nations is tackling the world's toughest problems through the new global goals, and we as Americans and as proud members of the United Nations Association have a duty to courageously engage with our policymakers. So, President Rose.
Well, at least someone was paying attention to this speech. If there is a person that needs no introduction on the Bowdoin campus, that person would have to be Senator Angus King, and it is even more curious that the introduction would be given by someone who is so new and from away. But here we go. Senator King and Mary Herman have deep, long, very robust connections to Bowdoin. Angus taught here for many years between leaving the governorship in Maine and heading off to Washington. He taught a course on leadership, which was incredibly well received here by our students. He's mentored many students, lectured here many times, and has been a contributor to many of our publications, including the Bowdoin Daily Sun, and his columns have been among the most well-received and most well-read that we have ever published. He is perhaps best known for addressing the first-year students within the week that they arrive, within the first few days that they arrive, and giving an amazingly rousing rendition of Joshua Chamberlain's actions on Little Round Top, and introducing them to the history of Bowdoin and to the amazing role that Bowdoin graduates, faculty, students played in the Civil War and in the fight for the Union and to abolish slavery. As you all know, he has a distinguished public service career, served 2 terms as Maine's governor, and in his second election won by the widest margin in the history of Maine. Going off to the Senate, he serves today, among other capacities, on the Select Committee on Intelligence, on the Armed Services Committee, and on the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and is a strident defender of conservation, of our planet, and of all of the security issues that we face. It is my great pleasure to welcome back, once again, Senator Angus King to Bowdoin.
Thank you. Hi, Bob. One of my oldest friends. I didn't know you were... You're that old? Yeah. I'll never catch up with you. No, I was reminded, you may have heard this story of a physics professor who was doing a nationwide lecture tour. And he gave this, he had a driver who went with him everywhere he went, and he'd give this lecture, and every time it was, pretty close to the same lecture. And after about the 20th time, the driver said, boss, I could give that lecture. And the physicist said, no, you couldn't possibly, it's complicated, all the formulas. And the driver said, no, I can do it. Let's try it at the next stop. So they traded uniforms, and the professor put on the little hat, and the driver went up and did the lecture flawlessly. But the professor said, yeah, but when the questions start, he's going to be in trouble. So he finishes the lecture, and the first question, somebody in the back of the room raises and asks this very complex, physics question, and the driver says, hell, that question's so easy, my driver in the back of the room can answer. So that was the way I felt walking in tonight with the questions. I want to start, before talking specifically about the UN, and talk a bit, there are going to be 3 parts. A little background, the UN, and then some observations about foreign policy. What you do in the Senate is largely determined by the committees that you're assigned to, which are not entirely random, but they aren't, this is sort of echoey, they aren't, you don't have a lot of control over it. When I arrived, I said to Harry Reid, I would very much like to be on the Armed Services Committee. Maine has had a senator on the Armed Services Committee without a break since the late 1940s. Actually, there was one 6-year period in the 70s, but that whole period, Margaret Chase Smith, Bill Cohen, we have always had someone on the Armed Services Committee. So I said, if you put me on the Armed Services Committee, you can put me wherever else you want. That was to sort of sweeten the deal. So I was assigned to the Armed Services Committee, the Budget Committee, the Rules Committee, and to prove Harry Reid had a sense of humor, the Intelligence Committee. But interestingly, those 2 assignments, intelligence and armed services, dropped me in the middle of everything that's been going on in the last 3 years. Syria, Iraq, ISIS, climate change, all of those issues. And I'm one of, I think, 3 senators on both intelligence and armed services. So it gives me a very interesting perspective because I'll have a hearing one day in armed services and roughly the same subject in intelligence. The Intelligence Committee meetings are almost always closed, but it's fascinating to get different views. For example, from military intelligence versus the CIA has sometimes quite different views of what's going on in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. But anyway, it's given me a very, very interesting perspective to be involved in these foreign policy issues. I have a deep background in foreign policy because I live in Maine and we can see Canada from there. Sorry, I couldn't resist. I don't know if you all know the definition of a Canadian. A Canadian is an unarmed North American with health insurance. That's a Canadian. But, all right. Let me back up a minute. I think we make a mistake by still measuring distance in miles. How far is it to Portland? 26 miles. 100 years ago, though, it was 7 hours to Portland. That's about what a horse walks, 4 miles an hour. Today, it's a half hour, 35 minutes. California today is about 3.5 hours away, but 100 years ago, it was 100 days away. It was almost 4 months. Do you see what I mean? When you measure distance in miles and you say, well, Portland's still the same distance as it was in 1880, but it isn't. It's a question of how long it takes to get there. And it's a cliche to say the world is shrinking, but it really is. If you measure distance in time, the world is a much smaller place than it was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. And In addition to transportation, we now, of course, don't even have to travel to get somewhere. On Thursday, I spent, I think, about 45 minutes or an hour, close to an hour, teaching a class at Yarmouth High School from Washington. I was in the basement of the Capitol looking at a camera. The kids could see and hear me. I could see and hear them. And I talked to them about foreign policy. It was a class involved with foreign affairs and foreign issues. And they asked me great questions about Syria and the Iran nuclear deal and everything you can imagine. But there was no distance at all, even though it was, you know, whatever it is, 11-hour drive from Yarmouth to Washington. It was instantaneous. Now, I wasn't quite there in person, but it was pretty darn close. It was 85 or 90%. And so this thing about the world being smaller is really true, literally, in a way that I don't think we reflect upon very much. The other thing about the world is today that it is, I think it's as complex a problem, foreign policy, as we've ever seen, and perhaps more so. I mean, the reason I hesitated when I said that is that Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, brilliant guy, testified before the Armed Services Committee on Wednesday, and he recounted the crises, you know, after World War II, after World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, all these things that, you know, the idea that, you know, it was the good old days, you know, is not entirely true. But this is an incredibly complex time for a couple of reasons that are unique. Historically, international relations has been relations between countries. England and France, Germany, China, Russia, you know, America and the Soviet Union, I mean, all countries, states. Now we have what in Washington are called non-state actors, Al-Qaeda. Tom Friedman calls them, you have superpowers and then you have super-empowered individuals. And in fact, in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, written in, I think, 1995, he mentions Osama bin Laden as a super-empowered individual. This was 6 years before September 11. So we've got countries, we've got groups of countries, and then we've got these non-state actors of organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Nusra, you know, you name it. And then you've got individuals. I'll tell you one of the things that keeps me awake from a point of view of intelligence and national security. It's not necessarily Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It's an isolated, alienated young man in Poughkeepsie who is radicalized online and who gets what amounts to a terrorist APB saying, if you're with us, go kill somebody. And we're seeing that starting to happen. And if you think about it, that's one of the hardest things in the world to deal with. There's no way to foil the plot if there isn't really a plot, because it's this disconnected. The people who are giving the order don't even know who this guy is. And it's very challenging. So now we've got countries, organizations, individuals, and then when you get to the cyber area, you've got good old garden variety crooks. You know, you have an inheritance in Ghana if you just answer this email. And there's a huge, the estimate is $500 billion is lost in the world economy, $500 billion, $455 billion to cyber crime. So it makes it incredibly complex. That means to me that you have to have multilateral organizations. I was thinking as I walked over here tonight, if we didn't have the UN, we'd have to invent it. We have to have some multilateral organizations in order to try to make sense of this, because these are transnational problems. The issues aren't necessarily limited to one country or one or two countries. The problems that we have are really go across multiple jurisdictions. And that brings us to the UN. A lot of people are critical of the UN because, we still have the occasional unfortunate war. Wasn't the UN created so that there wouldn't be war? Well, yes, and we do. We have had some very terrible periods in the last 70 years, but we haven't had a major world conflagration. And I believe that the forum created by the UN made a contribution to that end. We've had conflicts, but they've been more or less localized, and they haven't involved the entire planet. But that's not a fair way to judge the UN. If you judge it and say, well, there have been wars, therefore the UN is a failure, it misses the point that there are so many things that the UN does that nobody hears about. 2 years ago, I'd been in the Senate for 6 months. Carl Levin, the chair of the Armed Services Committee, asked me to go with him to Jordan and Turkey. And when your chair asks you to do something, you say yes. What I didn't know is he's the most vigorous 80-year-old on earth. And I was exhausted we landed at 6 p.m. and had 2 meetings that night, and it was just on from there. But one of the things we did was go to some of the refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey. And this was early. This was 2013, so the summer of 2013, so a little more than 2 years ago. At that time, the refugee camp in Jordan was the second largest city in Jordan. We have no conception here of the impact. We now are learning the impact of the refugees in Europe, but the influx of refugees to Jordan and Lebanon were unbelievable. I mean, like 1 million people in a country of 5 million. That's 20%. Do my math. That would be the equivalent of us taking 60 million people in terms of the impact on their country. But anyway, we went to the refugee camp, we walked around, talked to people, but you know what? Over the door it said, UN High Commission on Refugees. The UN was administering this. We were contributing, a lot of the world was contributing, but here's something you just don't hear, that's important. To deal with issues like this, to deal with refugees, which there are always refugees in the world, nothing like what we've seen in the last year or so. But the UN has all of these functions that we don't think about. This time last week, I was in Reykjavik, Iceland, at an international conference on the Arctic. There were about 1,700 people. And it was a lot about the Arctic, a lot about climate change. But the whole thrust of the meeting was, this is an issue, the Arctic, that has to be dealt with multilaterally. It has to be dealt with by a whole bunch of countries. The Arctic opening up, the ice melting, which is just extraordinary. If you want to see something amazing, Google or YouTube NOAA, N-O-A-A, Arctic ice. And there's an animation of what's happened to the Arctic ice over the last 15 or 20 years, and it's just absolutely stunning. But the Arctic is as if we had just discovered the Mediterranean Sea. It's a brand new ocean. It's almost as if it didn't exist before. It was all covered with ice. And now it's opening up, and it's as if, hey, we got the Mediterranean Sea here. And of course, it took about 1,000 years to get things settled around the Mediterranean Sea, between Egypt and Rome and not Corinth, Rome. Carthage. Carthage must be destroyed, right. Carthage. Not Carthage, Maine, Carthage. But all of the friction, around the Mediterranean, was a long period of human history. Now suddenly we've rediscovered this area that's bordered by Russia, Alaska, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with it in a non-confrontational way, and that involves multilateral diplomacy. It involves the UN. It involves the UN Law of the Sea Treaty, which, by the way, the United States is one of the only countries in the world that isn't a member. How dumb is that? I mean, Russia is staking out claims in the Arctic based upon the continental shelf under the auspices of the Law of the Sea Treaty, and we're not playing. We're not participating, and I think the argument is that somehow it will compromise our sovereignty. What people don't realize is we're gaining more than we're giving up. For example, did you ever stop and think that a red light compromises your sovereignty? You have to stop. It compromises your right to drive straight through. But it gives you the freedom to go through intersections and not worry about being killed. My old con law professor at Dartmouth, Vincent Starsinger, used to call it freedom through unfreedom. It's a very interesting concept. You give up something in order to get something more valuable. And I view the Law of the Sea Treaty as an opportunity for us. The whole idea of a treaty is that you agree to do things, the other side agrees to do things, but it gives us rights and opportunities that right now we just don't have. We're not playing. Russia is staking out claims, and we're watching and not able to participate. So it's called UNCLOS, UNCLOS. And that is something that we really, I think, ought to do. But right now in Congress, by the way, 89 votes. It got 89 votes. We couldn't get 89 votes for the time of day. Holy smoke. But this is something that we ought to do, but in today's atmosphere, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to, but we're hurting ourselves. This isn't altruism. I'm not, we want to join the Law of the Sea Treaty because we're nice guys. We want to join the Law of the Sea Treaty so we can have the benefits from it and have a rule-based structure that allows everybody to participate in this new area of the world where ships are going to be going. I think it's between 11 and 20 days shorter from China to the east coast of the U.S. over the top than it is through the Panama Canal. And as the ice continues to melt, that's going to become a very active trading lane. And by the way, some people have said, why does the senator from Maine care about the Arctic? Well, guess where those ships, the first ports in the U.S. when they come around, are in Maine. Eastport, Searsport, and Portland. We already, if you go down to Port of Portland, you see these big boxes with the word AIMSKIP, EIMSKIP. That's a Icelandic shipping company that ships between Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Greenland, Iceland, and they've made Portland their home port. Home port on the whole East Coast. They moved from Norfolk, Virginia, and a couple of other places to Portland because they see the potential that Portland and Maine have as a shipping center. And by the way, shipping is going to expand, I can't remember the number, something like 25% over the next 30 years. There's just so much stuff going back and forth around the world. And so we're a port state. It's one of the things we have, and it's one of our advantages. Maybe I ought to go and see what I thought I was going to say. Actually, I'm doing all right. Yeah, we've got to have more. I mean, everything that we're engaged in has an international aspect. Climate change is probably the greatest. We could do everything, and I can tell you as a political person, I can't go to the people of Maine and say, we need a carbon tax and we're going to make gas $6 a gallon if nothing's happening anywhere else in the world. That would be pointless. Air doesn't know about national boundaries. So dealing with an issue like climate change has to be a global effort. Now, that doesn't mean we don't do anything until it's all done internationally. It means we have to lead. And the president's recent discussions and agreements with China are a big deal. For China to concede that there's an issue here is a big deal. And now we need to get India engaged. And, but the point is, climate change is a perfect example of an issue that has to be handled globally. It has to be dealt with on an international basis. The Iran nuclear negotiations. A lot of people in this country, and I was just talking to a guy in Lewiston yesterday, have the impression that the Iran nuclear deal was between Obama and the Ayatollah. You know, it's a two-person deal. It's the US and Iran. No. It's the US, China, Russia, Germany, France, and Great Britain. 6 countries were negotiating that deal, not one. And that was one of the problems. My friend said, how come you supported it? And I said, because there wasn't any alternative. There wasn't, nobody ever presented a credible alternative because the other 5 countries had already adopted it. And if they had walked away, or I'm sorry, if we had walked away and they walked away from the sanctions, then you had Iran 2 or 3 months from a nuclear weapon, no restrictions, and the sanctions severely weakened. That, to me, was the worst of all worlds. The key moment for me was a meeting that we had. It was quite extraordinary, with the ambassadors from the other 5 countries. I'd never been in the room with, you know, China, Russia, England, France, and Germany, sitting at the table. And the question was asked, Kirsten Gillibrand from New York asked the question, what is the likelihood, if we don't approve this treaty, that you will stay with the sanctions and we can bring Iran back to the table to get a better deal? The British ambassador took the lead and said, far-fetched. That was the word I remember. I mean, it's a much longer answer, but the word far-fetched was in it. And that was one of the things that convinced me that this was the right thing to do, in spite of all the problems with the agreement. Lots of problems. There's lots of things I would have had differently. I would have liked it, instead of 15 years, to be 30 years. But the question wasn't, is this a good deal? It is, how is this deal compared to the alternative? That's the way you have to analyze choices. And, but again, the point I'm making here in the context of our discussion is multilateral. It wasn't just one country. It wasn't just 2 countries. And the sanctions, it wasn't just the 6 countries. The sanctions included people like Japan and India. And those are the countries, the outside of the US, that made the sanctions hurt Iran. We haven't bought Iranian oil for 40 years. So us saying we're not going to buy Iranian oil doesn't do anything to the Iranians. When the Japanese and the Indians and the Chinese say we're not going to buy Iranian oil, that's when it hurt. And that's why their participation was so important in making this, getting us to the point where we could make this multilateral deal. Climate, the Iran nuclear negotiations, refugees. By the way, I asked this question in the committee meeting. John McCain, I have to tell you, took over, when the Republicans took control of the Senate, John McCain took over as chair of the Armed Services Committee. He has convened the most extraordinary set of hearings at the Armed Services Committee this year. It's a who's who of foreign policy experts. On Wednesday, we had Bob Gates. On Thursday, we had 4 professors from various think tanks and universities. We've had Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, Brzezinski, Nick Burns. I mean, when my time came to question the other day, I said to the 4 professors, I said, welcome, you are now unpaid faculty members at McCain University. But I really like what he's done, and this isn't partisan. I mean, he's invited the best thinkers in the country to give us an opportunity to think about the larger questions, not just how many F-35 should we buy, or what the specifics, sexual assault in the military or base closures, all of those very important issues which the Armed Services Committee deals with, but to get the bigger picture has really been extraordinary. I've just loved it. I said this to McCain. Lincoln was once asked what he would do if he was given an hour to split a cord of wood. And his answer was, I'd spend the first 15 minutes sharpening my axe. Most of us would just start chopping, right? That's what most of us would do. But I consider these hearings that we've had as sharpening our axe, thinking in a larger sense, rather than just, hitting away at the, what shall we do in Syria, or what shall we do in Lebanon or Iraq. I mean, that's important stuff. That's our job. But in order to put it into some kind of overall strategic context, I think is really important. And again, all of these things, whether it's Iraq, Syria, it all involves multiple countries. It involves the UN. It involves UN resolutions. Syria, for example, I think there's a solution. I'm trying to think of how adamant I want to be about this. But here's the solution. Number one, countries act in their own interest. Okay? Countries don't act because they're nice guys or because they want to look good in the eyes of the world or whatever. They act in their own interest. We do, other people do. We have a commonality of interest with the Russians right now, and that is ISIS. ISIS is as serious or more serious a threat to the Russians than it is to us, because they already have a jihadist terror network in the Caucasus, and they are already fighting terrorism, and something like 3,000 members of ISIS came from Russia. And Russia's a lot easier to get to for them than we are. So Russia has they have a national interest in dealing with ISIS. Now the problem is they're trying to deal with ISIS and prop up Assad at the same time. The problem with that is Assad is what gave rise to ISIS, and you're not going to be able to defeat ISIS as long as you're propping up Assad. Our task is to work with them to try to find a way to work together against ISIS and say, look, let's transition Assad out over 6 months or a year, leave something there. They're rightfully worried, as we should be. What happens if Assad goes? I was in a hearing with the director of the CIA, and my question was, if Assad left tomorrow, what would happen? Nobody really knows. Do you know how many opposition groups there are in Syria? 2,000. 2,000 different groups, from ISIS and al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate, all the way over to moderate, so-called moderate opposition. It's unbelievably complicated. And so the Russians are worried that we could have Libya too, where the dictator goes and the whole country just devolves into chaos. That would be catastrophic. So I think there is a multilateral opportunity here with Russia, just as we did with chemical weapons. Remember the chemical weapons? It was Russia and the US that got them out. Russia is Assad's patron. He couldn't survive without Russia, and Iran, but principally Russia, now, particularly now that Russia's on the ground over there. So I think there's a multilateral opportunity there. And then other things like that we don't think about the UN, but things like air travel, drugs, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, just making sense of the international air system. And then I'll say finally. Mary says I say finally too much, it gets people's hopes up. I think the UN plays a crucial function, what I call the convening function. The function of bringing people into a forum that has the attention of the world. Whether it's, I remember I was a freshman in college. A freshman? Yeah, I was a freshman in college in October of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. And the crucial moment was Adlai Stevenson at the UN, where he was able to turn the tables on the Russians, on the Soviets, and basically mobilize world opinion in our favor, to present the evidence of what was actually going on in Cuba with the missiles. The UN provided the forum, if you will. And the UN provides a forum for world leaders to speak, to occasionally meet. And I think that's a very important, maybe it's not in the UN Charter somewhere, but it's a very important function. Just having a place where people can go on an international stage and they have to respond to world opinion. And I think that's one of the most important functions that the UN, capabilities that the UN provides. This is a very difficult world, and there are no easy answers. As I said, it's one of the most complex that I have ever seen. And I'm just glad that we have the UN, because as I said before, if we didn't, we'd have to invent it. We might invent it in smaller pieces, in regional pieces, but in this day and age, when the distance between Beijing and Washington is essentially zero, we've got to have international organization to be able to establish standards for cybercrime, standards for air travel, standards for shipping, just the kind of day-to-day things that make the world function. And I see it as an essential part of that piece of kind of world infrastructure that allows us to lead the kind of lives that we want to lead. Edie, do you think Lincoln would work here?
Absolutely.
Lincoln, in December of 1862, went to the Congress because the Congress was basically doing politics as usual, even in the midst of the Civil War. And he was trying to get them to understand, to sort of shake them, that this was a new situation and that doing things the way they'd always been done just wasn't going to work. That this was a major catastrophe and that they had to think about things in different ways and they couldn't just do everything in business as usual. And at the end of that speech that he made, it was December 2nd, 1862, he uttered what I think is the most profound observation about how to deal with change that I've ever heard. And of course, everything I've been talking about tonight is change. Here's what Abraham Lincoln said. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty. Therefore, we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. We must disenthrall ourselves, think in new and different ways, and then we shall save our planet. Thank you all. Now I get the questions from the professor.
They're from the audience presented by.
Okay.
Do you have some from Twitter?
There is one question from Twitter. The Russian delegation to the United Nations called for moving the headquarters of the United Nations to a more neutral country.
Interesting.
Any observation?
Lib says we have a Twitter question that says the Russians have proposed moving the headquarters to a more neutral country. Never really thought about it. The headquarters have been where they are. It's one of the world's great cities. It's easy to get to by air. And, you know, I don't really have I can't imagine a place that would be more convenient to the whole world as one of the easiest places in the world to get to. So I don't think it, ironically, the people who might join the Russians in that are some people in America who don't like the UN and have wanted it gone for a long time. No, you know, ask them if they want to pay for it, I guess, would be where I'd start. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that I just graded a whole bunch of midterms, so I'm good at reading difficult handwriting. So this is very good. Okay. I'll speak up. So we have one question from the audience that says, we heard a spirited defense of the liberal arts education by Mr. Yeo. But I'm curious, Senator, if you feel liberal arts education prepares students to tackle, or us collectively to tackle, the issues that you discussed today.
Yes. I can't imagine any other way to do it. Somebody once recently said, "What do you do down there?" And I said, "It's applied history with a minor in communications." I mean, if you don't have a way of a context of history and sociology and government and all of those kinds of things, I just don't know how you make sense of these things. Now, you know, we have one of my favorite people in the Senate is Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, who's an engineer, one of the few. I think there are only 2 in the Senate, and you need people that have that kind of expertise. But boy, I think it would be a big mistake to make it to not have a liberal arts education. That's how you understand the world, in my view.
Another question from the audience. I truly respect your willingness to compromise, but what are some issues in which you would not compromise?
Wow.
It's a good audience.
I haven't ever thought of it in those terms. Well, there are lots of things to say about compromise. President Kennedy, I think, said we should never compromise out of fear, but we should never fear to compromise. I mean, you don't compromise basic issues of human rights, I think. You don't compromise about slavery or human trafficking. You don't say some human trafficking is okay, but not too much. I think it's hard to answer that question in the abstract. I've thought a lot about the question of leadership, as has President Rose, and one of the key elements of leadership is character, integrity. And character is hard to define, but it involves integrity, honesty, and principles. But you can't have principles that are so rigid that you can't then try to solve problems. Principles are good, rigidity is bad. And I don't know, you have to draw that line, I think, in each case. Here's an example of something I'm working on right now. There are people who want very much to allow the export of crude oil from the U.S. In the oil embargo of the 70s, a law was passed, crude oil could not be exported. Today, we're producing more crude oil than we can use, and the oil industry and the states where it's drilled very much want to export it. In a perfect world, maybe I wouldn't want to do that. But on the other hand, if in exchange for getting a crude oil export, I can negotiate some significant environmental benefits, I'm willing to listen. Do you see what I mean? Because there's a world price for crude oil, so it wouldn't affect the world price. It wouldn't affect our consumers. Now, I'm very much against exporting natural gas because there's not a world price for natural gas. It's different in the U.S. than it is in China, and I think that would be a national security mistake. But crude oil, but the point I'm trying to make is, if you can get things done and do positive things while you're also doing something that somebody else wants, that's the way the process is supposed to work. The real problem in Washington now is there are people who won't compromise. Period. And if somebody says they won't compromise, what they're really saying is, I have all the answers. I'm 100% right. Nobody's 100% right. But what's really ironic is that people who talk about their commitment to the Constitution and then say they won't compromise, know no history. The United States Senate was the product of compromise. I learned in the 6th grade it was called the Great Compromise, because they couldn't decide how to allocate the representation in the Congress. The big states wanted population, the small states wanted the states, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, it almost broke up. And Roger Sherman came up with this idea of let's have 2 houses. One by population, one by states. It was a compromise. And to say now we won't compromise is just nonsense. So that's how'd I do ducking the question? I'm sure there are things I wouldn't compromise, but I can't reel them off.
Okay. I thought it was a good answer. Okay. Another question from our audience. How will the UN be able to implement its new goals when the UN fails to understand different social and cultural understandings of the communities they attempt to serve? How can the UN improve helping people in the future?
I think that's a really, really good question. And one of my observations is that we don't do a good enough job generally of understanding other cultures and people. I met a guy a few years ago who was about my age, and he said, you go through, where are you from? Where were you born? He said, I was born in Japan. He was an American, he wasn't Japanese. He said, I was born in Japan, 1947 or something. How come? How come you were born in Japan? My father was my father was a cultural anthropologist, an expert on the culture and history of the Japanese people, and MacArthur hired him to help him draft the Constitution for Japan after the war, because MacArthur wanted the Constitution to fit and make sense within the culture and history of Japan. Isn't that brilliant? I don't think we do enough of that today. We don't understand other cultures and other societies very well. We tend to impose our sort of European linear thinking on other people. Vietnam is a classic example where, we've had this strategy and said, well, we can bomb them. We have overwhelming force. There are these guys, in rice paddies. What we didn't understand was the nature of their struggle, the commitment they had to it, and that they were going to outlast us. And we continually make those kind of mistakes. That's why I think, for example, it would be a huge mistake for us to send troops into Syria against ISIS. That's what ISIS wants. They want this to be a war between Islam and the West. The war, the on-the-ground war, has to involve Muslims and people from the region. They can't be invaders from another culture. So I think the UN, that's something the UN has to work on, and I think we all have to work on. I think our foreign policy often makes mistakes by not understanding and getting the cultures of other countries. When I used to teach leadership about Chamberlain, one of Chamberlain's qualities was empathy. Chamberlain understood his men. Shackleton understood his men. That's an essential leadership quality, and we can't lead in the world unless we understand other people. They do not think like us. The idea that we could somehow turn Iraq into a Western democracy in 3 years, it took us 200 years, and we're still not all that good at it. I mean, if you look at American history, a whole lot of things came together at the same time that allowed this system to arise that we take for granted and that don't exist in other places. So we've got to be much more sensitive to how people differ around the world. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that we need to tolerate inhuman behavior. That gets to this principle thing. I mean, we have to understand other cultures, but we also have to, we're struggling towards some universal human rights concepts that I think are also important.
In regards to John Kerry's insistence that Assad must go, isn't it better for the United States to be dealing with one state actor as opposed to over 2,000 non-state actors?
Yeah, well, that was my question the other day. What if Assad leaves? What if Assad has a heart attack tomorrow and disappears? What happens? And I think we have to be very careful about that. One of the big mistakes we made in Iraq, and in fact, we made the mistake in this country 150 years ago, was de-Baathification. Remember that word? De-Baathification. We got rid of Saddam, but then we swept out everybody in his party that ran the country. All the bureaucrats, all the people that, that had been members of the Ba'ath Party were not allowed to have leadership roles in the new government. So basically, the whole infrastructure of the government that made it run from day to day disappeared. Interestingly enough, did you know the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution has a de-Baathification clause? It says in it, no one who was active in the rebellion against the country can hold public office. So we swept away a whole generation of leadership in the South and denied them the opportunity to have leadership positions. And in my view, that prolonged and aggravated the reintegration of the South into the country. But I think that's a mistake. And that doesn't mean we prop up Assad. I think the deal is we work with the Russians and say, look, Assad is a lightning rod. The longer we wait, the weaker he's going to get. The more the Russians, are going to be engaged in this quagmire. So let's slide him over to Switzerland and leave some kind of structure there for a functioning government, and then try to transition to a more open regime. But it's going to be very, very difficult, and it's going to be more difficult now than it would have been a couple of years ago because ISIS and al-Nusra, they're not going to have any part of any government, whether it's Assad or anybody else. So it's very difficult.
Several questions evolve around the idea of does the United States have an ethical obligation to accept refugees? And what would that look like?
Really good question, and I've thought a lot about that. Historically, we have sort of a mixed record on refugees. What was the name of the ship with the Jews? The New Orleans, was it? What was it? The St. Louis. The St. Louis. A ship called the St. Louis left Europe with 400 or 500 Jewish refugees, and they weren't allowed in. They weren't allowed in. This was 38, 39. They went to Cuba. They weren't allowed there. They went to Canada. They weren't allowed there, I believe Canada. And then they went back to Europe, and about half of them ended up dying in the Holocaust. So this is not easy for us. We've always had quotas, not always. Before about 1880, we had virtually no immigration laws. I have a lot of people who get mad at me about immigration and say, my ancestors came here legally. Well, most of ours did because there weren't any laws. In fact, if you read, this is really interesting, if you read the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence is this grand language by Jefferson about human rights and all, he meant to say all people are created equal. He said all men, but he meant people. But then he said, it behooves us to list the reasons we're separating, and he has this long list of 15 or 20 depredations by George III, one of which is he has prevented immigrants from coming to our shores. Isn't that amazing? That was considered one of the worst things George III did. So should we take in? I think we should, of course. I mean, the question is how many and how do we, and it's complicated, and this is now I've got my national security hat on. This one is particularly complicated because of the danger of terrorists, blending in with a group of legitimate Syrian refugees. It's not an easy, you can't just say, yes, we should let them in. And the first thing, if 10 guys are in that group and they blow up the Sears Tower, people are going to say, what? Why did we do that? So it has to be, there has to be some process. But I think it's part of who we are. What does it say on the Statue of Liberty? Give me your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to be free. I mean, that's what this country's all about. The other thing, this is from the point of view of Maine, we need people. When I was governor, there were 17,000 kids in each class of school, 4th, 5th, 6th. I happen to remember that number because that's how many 7th graders there were. I remember that. 17,000, okay? Today, there are 13,000 and falling. 17 to 13. That's a big drop. That's not a little bit. That's a big drop. And it's I call it a sort of demographic anti-bomb. People talk about a demographic bomb where there's growth. It's going to go this way. And when I travel around Maine now and visit businesses, which I do a lot of, the number one thing they say every time, we can't find enough qualified workers. That's the biggest problem facing Maine businesses today. That's the first thing they tell me. And so we have to be thinking about bringing people here. And you know what? Let's think about refugees for a minute. These are the people that have the gumption to get up and get out. Aren't those the kind of people that we want? I went with Susan Collins last summer, the summer before last, to McAllen, Texas, down on the Mexican border when all the kids were coming in to sort of see what was going on and learn a bit about it. And we were in the border place, and they had these cells, where people were being held. And there was one cell with this one kid. And I went over and just started chatting with him. He was 16 years old. I said, where are you from? I expected, he could speak a little bit of English. I expected him to say El Salvador, Honduras. Bangladesh. Bangladesh? How the hell did you get here? He said, well, I got on a steamer from Bangladesh to Ecuador, and then I got, from Ecuador to Peru, and from Peru to Venezuela, and then he'd been through 9 countries, 16 years old, and got himself to the U.S. border. I turned to the guard and said, we want this guy. Get him in and he'll be president of Procter & Gamble in 25 years. Think of the initiative and the intelligence and the perseverance that young man had by himself to make that trip. It's unbelievable. So that's a long way of saying, I don't know whether the right number is 50,000 or 100,000 or 10,000, but I do think it is. I think there is an ethical obligation, and I think it's also in our best interest.
Would the UN have a way of bringing non-state actors to the negotiating table?
Well, that's something we really have to think about. I don't know how you would define them as the problem, and I don't know whether they'd want to come to the table. I don't know how you negotiate with ISIL or Al-Qaeda. And even if you negotiate with them, does that bind the next group? I think there should be some effort, though, to try to have some interaction to see if there are ways that they can be tamed, if you will, or be made to be less dangerous. But I think it's very hard because these are people that essentially have rejected all international norms, law, civilization. I mean, the ISIS to me is an 8th century institution with 21st century weapons. I mean, that's really, they're doing things that we've sort of not done much of in this world since about 1200.
There's a couple questions regarding what do you see as your priority action for the UN on climate change?
I think the priority action are to get the major developing countries, particularly India and China, to take it seriously. And of course, we have to take it seriously and be, I don't have my card, we have to be leaders. That's why I think the President's Clean Power Plan is so important, because it's us actually doing something, taking an action, rather than just talking about it. I sense, and there's no empirical evidence for this, but I sense that the deniers are getting tired of denying. That they really can't keep a straight face much anymore. The debate ought to be, what do we do? Not what's happening. And I reach into my pocket, and this is the one jacket that I have that didn't have it. I carry these cards with me everywhere I go, that on one side, it's a million years of CO2 in the atmosphere, in a graph. And it just sort of squiggles along for 990,000 plus years. And then in 1860, it goes like this. The band is between, I don't know, what is it, Pete, 300 and 200 roughly? And now it's 400. Its CO2 is the highest it's been in 3 million years. And you look at that and look at the the middle 1800s, it answers two of the questions. A, is something happening? Yes, you can see it. I mean, and people, every now and then you'll hear somebody say, well, it varies over time. No. It varies, yes. But what's happened in the last 150 years is way out of the band of the way it's varied. It's just dramatic. This is the graph that convinced me. On the other side of the card, okay, so the second question is, did people have something to do with it? 1850, anyone? I mean, I was in a debate once, and the other guy said, well, volcanoes. Oh, come on. We had volcanoes, but it wasn't that 1850. So that answers two of the three questions. Is something happening? Yes. People have something to do with it? Yes. Third question, so what? CO2, so what? Invisible, odorless gas. Turn the card over, and it shows the million years of the correlation between CO2 and temperature. And it's almost exact. CO2 goes up, temperature goes up. CO2 goes down, temperature goes down, just like this. And all of a sudden, CO2 is way up here. This is like debating that light goes 186,000 miles a second. Why? I don't get why this is a political issue. I literally don't understand how this became a partisan political issue, except it was invented by Al Gore. I mean, that's the only thing I can figure. If it was Al Gore's idea, it can't be right. So I don't think there's the slightest doubt of what's happening scientifically. The real question is, what do we do? And it's hard decisions. The Clean Power Plan is going to be effective, and I don't think it'll be horribly disruptive, although it will be very disruptive in some parts of the country. But then, there are a whole lot of other steps that involve our personal decisions and what kind of vehicles we drive and what kind of mileage we get. That's where the debate ought to be taking place, it seems to me, as to, what do we do about it, not is something happening. And I sense that over the next few years, people are going to start understanding that. And the Pope came. And I'm not a Roman Catholic, but this Pope is something else. He's really something. And he talked about climate change, as you know. And some of my colleagues took to the floor of the U.S. Senate to berate him for getting out of the area of ethics and theology and into the area of politics. The Pope ought to be sticking with. So I went over and I actually took a Bible onto the Senate floor and made a speech about how this is theology and ethics. So that's all it is. I found some wonderful quotes in the Bible about stewardship. And did you know that God told Moses that the land was entitled to a Sabbath every 7 years, just like people? Did you know that? That you had to give the land a break every 7 years? That's in Exodus. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. But here's what I think the fundamental, this is an ethical issue, guys. This is an ethical issue. Thou shalt not steal has a temporal aspect as well as a spatial aspect. And by that means I can't steal out of your purse, but I also can't steal from my grandchildren. And if we take the resources away from our grandchildren, to me that's an ethical violation, just as if you knock somebody down on the street and take something out of their pocket. We have the planet on loan. And if we don't do something, we're going to be held accountable. I will tell you a little secret about Congress. There's something we really do really well. Really well. Avoid things. The highway trust fund, the budget, the debt limit, climate change. I mean, if it's a serious issue that can be avoided, we've extended the highway trust fund 34 times. And I'm afraid, but I shouldn't, it's human nature. How many of you did your book report before Sunday night? Really? I mean, you can't say these are bad people. They aren't bad people. I know them. They're very good people. But it's just hard institutionally, and it's also hard because we politicians have created an atmosphere where our constituents expect us to be able to fix things at no cost. When I used to travel around Maine as governor, there were 3 things everybody wanted. Governor, we need Route 26 fixed, or 1, or 118, whatever it is. We need Route 26 fixed. We need more money for our schools and lower taxes. I went into a general store up north riding the motorcycle. The woman saw me coming. She was behind the counter like this when I walked in. She had her hands on either side of the cash register. I walked in the door. She said, "Ha, the tax man." I'm a big boy. I paid my bill, started to walk out. As I got to the door, she said, "Where are you going from here?" I said, "We're headed south." She said, "Good. I hope you have a bumpy ride. Maybe you'll fix the road." Without a trace of irony or paradox. But that's, we've all got it. We're all in this. We've got to. Anyway, I don't mean to apologize for Congress, except it is, we are not, the voters don't give us any slack, you see, to fix these things. And we've created an expectation that we can fix the things without any cost. And so we're sort of caught in this trap of delay. But hopefully, every now and then, we're able to make some good decisions and actually get a few things done. I have one thought about the debt ceiling. You all, I know it wasn't a question, but this is on my mind. You've got to understand what the debt ceiling is. It shouldn't be called the debt ceiling. It should be called the pay your bills ceiling. Because I guarantee if you took a poll in Maine tomorrow, 90% of people would think that if expanding the debt ceiling is allowing more government spending in Washington, right? We're opening the doors to more spending. Cut off the debt ceiling, they'll stop spending. The problem is the debt ceiling deals with money we've already spent. It's exactly like spending on your credit card for a month and at the end of the month saying, I'm not going to pay. That's what not doing the debt ceiling is. But everyone thinks it's prospective when actually it's retrospective. We've already spent the money. So if you think about it, this is hog heaven for a politician. You vote for the spending, you send the press release out for the grant going to your fire department, And then you vote against the debt ceiling to pay for that, and you're a fiscal conservative. Come on. And these folks are talking about not extending the debt ceiling, which would be economically catastrophic. It would probably almost undoubtedly cause a rise in interest rates, mortgages, student loans, devalue the dollar around the world. Nobody really knows if the United States defaulted on its debt. And it occurred to me the other day, what if I went to the Intelligence Committee Tuesday afternoon and the CIA is there? And they said, we've discovered an al-Qaeda plot to devalue the dollar, cause interest rates to go up in the United States, and we're going to devastate the world economy. We'd bomb them, and yet that's what we're going to do to ourselves. At least that's what some people are talking about doing to ourselves. Do you think this irritates me? Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, on that note, one of the members of the audience would like to know if you think the Senate is functioning anymore.
That's yes and no. Here's the way I've thought about it and seen it. There are three levels of work in the Senate, three levels of legislation. There's a top level of big stuff, immigration, gun control, budgets, not working, okay? Nobody doubts that, not working. But then there's a second level of pretty important things. We just passed a total rewrite of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act by, I think, 67 votes. Last year, we totally redid the Veterans Administration law. We totally rewrote the federal job training law, all by 60 or 70 votes, went to the president. So there are things being done, is what I'm saying. Some pretty important things. You never hear about it because it's not big news. The news is the confrontation, the conflict on the front page. When the elementary and secondary education bill passed, it was a little story on page 4. I used to say when I was in Augusta, if I got up one morning and walked to work across the Kennebec River, the headline would be "King Unable to Swim." Legislature critical. So then there's a third level. Then there's a third level of small stuff that gets done usually by unanimous consent that you hear nothing about, although we did get some press yesterday. We got a little bill through about prenatal heroin addiction and doing something about it. A horrible problem. Remember I mentioned 12,000 kids? There are 12,000 births a year in Maine. Last year, 955 of those 12,000 were addicted to heroin. The babies when they're born. That's 1 out of 12. Isn't that unbelievable? So this is a real problem. Anyway, we got the bill passed. Went through the Senate just Thursday. So there are things being done. It's the big stuff that's not working. And the other problem is, and Bob remembers this, Bob worked for Ed Muskie in the 60s and 70s, and I worked for Bill Hathaway in the early 70s. I could swear, Bob, you check me on this, I could swear that in those days it was about 80% governing and 20% politics. It was mostly governing. They were going to committee meetings, conferences, doing their work. Today it's just the opposite. It's 80% politics and 20% governing. And we have all these votes in the Senate. On the Iran deal, we had 3 or 4 identical votes. We had the vote. It was done. Every single senator had announced what their position was going to be. Everybody knew what it was going to be. But we spent a week and a half having repeated votes because Mitch McConnell thought it was somehow going to trap the Democrats to keep voting. It had no legislative purpose. And Harry Reid's done a lot, done the same thing. I'm not being partisan here. But that's the way the place works. It's all about trapping the other guy or woman into voting for something. Last year there was a great bill on energy efficiency sponsored by Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire and Rob Portman of Ohio, and it never could get through the Senate because Jeanne Shaheen was running for re-election against Scott Brown in New Hampshire, and the Republicans didn't want Jeanne Shaheen to have a victory. And I hasten to add, it works both ways. Both parties do this. And it's very frustrating. I said to Kay Rand the other day, I'm really tired of messaging votes. Let's do the stuff that we're supposed to be doing.
To follow up on that thought, a member of the audience would like to know, what is the impact of partisanship that's happening now on American foreign policy?
Another really good question. The old saying was from Arthur Vandenberg in the early 50s that partisanship stops at the water's edge. No longer true. I think the greatest disappointment of my time so far in Washington was the fact that the Iran deal was a 100% partisan vote. I really couldn't believe that was going to happen, that something of that magnitude was going to just turn into all one side and all the other. I was particularly disappointed that I think 19 of my colleagues announced their opposition to the deal within less than an hour of its announcement, which meant there's no possible way to have read it or known any details of what was in it. Well, in fact, 47 of them wrote to the Ayatollah saying, don't do this at all with our president, and we're just going to tear it up. Can you imagine the Congress doing that, writing to Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis and saying, don't negotiate with this guy Kennedy? That was extraordinary. It has affected foreign policy. Not completely. In the Iran deal it did, but there's a lot of bipartisan foreign policy. And I think there are people who are, in good faith trying to work on these things in a bipartisan way. But the overall atmosphere is so partisan and so political that it's hard for any issue not to become a partisan issue, which is, I think, really too bad. But it's where we are. I mean, you got to play the hand that's dealt you, right? And right now, that's the hand that we're dealt. These people are getting tired.
I don't know. Do we have time for a couple more?
How about one more?
Feel like that? One more?
Libby says one more.
Libby says one more. Libby's in charge.
I always
Okay.
do what Libby says.
Let's say that sounds like a plan. So, which of the present foreign policy platitudes from government officials or the media are the most dangerous to us?
Dangerous? Oh, I don't know. I think one of the most dangerous is to think that we can unilaterally impose our will. I mean, if there's anything we've learned in the last 20 years, it's that won't work. And it gets back to the UN. Lasting accomplishments are going to have to involve multilateral efforts, just because that's where the country is. You can't win a war with air power, with only air power. I mean, that's something that I think is we tend to think air power can do it. It usually can't. I think we sometimes tend to be too ready to intervene without fully thinking about the consequences. I love Colin Powell's Pottery Barn principle. If you break it, you own it. And I think we need to think about that. And just recent history, Iraq, Libya. I mean, we need to think about. You can't just think. And I've had these debates with John McCain about the Ukraine. John McCain and Lindsey Graham and others, and plenty of Democrats, want to arm the Ukrainians, arm the Ukrainian rebels or the Ukrainian government against the separatists and the Russians. And my question is always, what next? Okay, they say they want tanks and howitzers. We give them tanks and howitzers. And Putin, who happens to live in the neighborhood, says, okay, I'll see your tanks and howitzers, and we're going to put in some MiGs And then the Ukrainians say, well, we need some F-35s or F-16s. My comment in the committee was, if you're going to play chess with a Russian, you better think 3 moves ahead. And it's not thinking of consequences, I think. I mean, the Libya thing is in the news, and I think they're legit. It's funny, the legitimate questions about Libya weren't what they talked about at the hearing the other day for 11 hours. The legitimate question is, what was our plan for after Gaddafi fell? And it appears that there really wasn't. And it's the same thing in Syria. If we went in tomorrow with a drone and took out Assad, as I've said several times, what would happen then? I think one of the greatest mistakes in foreign policy is acting precipitously without thinking about, okay, how do you get out? How does this end? That's where I differ with my colleagues. It's the conventional wisdom in Washington that we should be arming the Ukrainians, and I'm just not so sure because I don't know where it stops, and because they have the geographic advantage. They're right there. They can match anything that we do. And in fact, one of our witnesses on Thursday pointed out that in Syria it's the opposite. They're stretched to get to Syria, and they don't have that geographic advantage. But I think one of my principles is before you get in, you've got to really understand the consequences, what can go wrong, and how you get out. It's very hard for somebody in my job to see these young men and women whose lives have been destroyed by the Gulf War. You know, people who are paraplegics, people with immense psychological problems, and we need to really think hard before we commit those good people to conflict. We have to really A, know what our national interest is, and B, understand how to get out, how it's going to end. I hate to end on such a low note, but anyway, this has been fun. Your questions were almost as good as the Yarmouth High School questions. Thank you all very much.